Now I'm very happy to introduce our today's first speaker, Aria Dean, who is an artist, curator and writer based in New York and in Los Angeles. Aria is editor and curator of Arisen, the New York-based nonprofit dedicated to the preservation and championship of born digital art and culture. Her writing has been featured in Texte zur Kunst, eFlux, Art in America and Art Forum, amongst others. As an artist, her recent solo exhibition and two-person exhibitions include Meta Models, or How I Got My Groove Back, that took place at Chapter in New York, Aria Dean, that was on view at the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, Lonesome Crowded West, that was on view in Chateau Zatho in Los Angeles, and White People Think I'm Radical, that has been shown at Arcadia Missa in London. Aria has also participated widely in group exhibitions internationally and has lectured and presented work at various institutions and universities with the focus of reconfigurations of subjectivity. We are very happy that with Aria, we start the symposium from the perspective on the arts. With her, we can take a look on the framing conditions in which art is created, perceived, and discussed, and which implication this has on society. Now, please join me in welcoming Aria Dean.
Hi, I'm Aria. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Suzanne and to Anna for organizing this, and to the whole MMK team. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to hear from everyone today, and glad I get to go first and be done with it. So my name is Aria, and I work primarily as a curator and editor at Rhizome at the New Museum, which is, if you're not familiar, an art and technology-focused organization that looks mostly at digital art and culture. It was founded in 1996, but I'm also an artist and independent critic as well, and so I guess this lecture focuses more, I guess, on the things that have preoccupied me in my own artistic practice and writing practice for the last few years. So I'll just dive into it, I guess. This is a slide of some work of mine. So I think that this talk is it's obliquely titled Bad Infinity, but it kind of, I guess, like the subtitle would be sort of the visual life of social death. And it kind of, I guess, is taking stock of a longer project that I've been, I think, slowly working towards and building on through various writing projects over the course of the last few years. And in the process of writing certain things things I've written in like 2016, I've kind of been revisiting and kind of not only parsing through what I was trying to do in those writing projects, but also the ways that they were received by a larger public, particularly in the US, and kind of trying to like retrieve certain elements and dig further into the things that I felt like haven't gotten discussed. So this talk I'm going to talk a bit about what some of that stuff was, or some of the stuff that I feel like got glossed over in those writing projects and what those projects were overall, but then kind of digging further into this larger project that I'm interested in and mapping like my thoughts around it. But largely speaking, I think that my work overall and this sort of ongoing writing project or critical project, I would say that the best way to frame it is probably as some sort of ongoing critique of representation, but not simply on representational tactics, but a critique of representation as a framework for understanding artworks overall, be they sculptures, paintings, or moving images, writing, music, etc., but just this representational paradigm that has dominated pretty much the whole course of Western art history. So these are just some, you don't have to pay that much attention to those, but so a few years ago, just like to give background on this, I wrote this piece for the New Inquiry called Closing the Loop that focused on it was in a moment when there were sort of emergent feminist practices feminist practices around image making on the internet that I think ended up being kind of termed selfie feminism largely, at least in the US. And I was writing about this or thinking about it for a long time, and then started writing about it, and kind of, I guess, like wanted to critique what I viewed as sort of like a twofold misstep on the part of many of the people who were involved in this sort of line of thinking, which was one, that the framework that they were using was largely based in a sort of like white European psychoanalytical framework for understanding the relationship between men and women, and therefore and overly reliant on a sort of like Laura Mulvey, like 1970s film kind of feminist perspective, which of course, like racially, I think remains quite narrow, but then additionally, like in terms of the technological moment we were in, felt like it really didn't apply to the actual like infrastructures that these images were being circulated in, and kind of was asking the question, like, what does it mean? Like, do we have an adequate politic of looking and being looked at on the internet? And that was in like 2016. And so that was kind of the first time I was trying to work on that. And I think that like when I wrote that, a lot of the response kind of really got stuck at the layer of like the social critique, and kind of was like, oh, like Aria Dean says like white women artists like shouldn't do selfies or whatever, and that was like certainly not my intention. I was much more interested in like a theoretical and social commentary on the sort of like infrastructural level. And so, yeah, and then additionally, the other part of the project, or another writing project that I had that I think has sort of created the ground for what I'm interested in right now, was this piece about memes and Black cultural production that I wrote in 2017 called Poor Meme, Rich Meme, or Rich Meme, Poor Meme, Rich Meme. And it was kind of looking at the ways that at that moment, meme culture online felt very, very dominated by like largely American Black teenagers, and what that meant in terms of like labor dynamics and cultural production and circulation. Like, what does it mean to produce something and then it just flies off into the internet and is repurposed like countless times, and you never see any remuneration for that circulation or any sort of credit. But then beyond that, also looking at memes as a sort of maybe not new, but a very particular kind of ontology for an image. And so the way that a meme's structure really depends on its incorporation into a larger body of images that appear similar to it. So of course we have like a meme that is the one thing you see in your feed, but then also the whole point of it is that it is related to a whole body or a whole collective of images. And I was interested in what that meant for image circulation online, but then also what that sort of as an object lesson could mean for just ontologies overall, and then also the sort of relationship between Blackness as an ontological situation and the meme as an ontological situation, like that there was some sort of attraction between the two. Anyway, sorry, this is like a lot of background. But so yeah, so I mean, those are these two things. And so I think that like, as I've moved away, I've stepped away from those projects, they have a life of their own, and continued to incorporate those ideas and questions into my own practice. I think I've kind of been returning to them and kind of wondering, like what succeeded, what failed, and what am I interested in? Because people ask me to like talk about those topics, and I'm like, I don't really, I'm not that interested in memes right now. Like the meme thing is like very different in 2020 than it was in like 2017. But I think that what remains interesting is this question of representation, and I think this question of a politic of looking and being looked at, and just a politic of visual culture after the internet. And so I guess like that's where this sort of fits into this performing society thing. I think like what I'm going to talk about a bit today is the ways in which the art world is a microcosmic performance of society, I suppose, but then also the ways in which like society maybe is only a performance at all. I don't know, something like that. But yeah, so anyway, I'll just get into it. But so basically I'm just going to talk about this idea of the visual life of social death and kind of map my thinking towards this larger project. And talk about some moments in the art world in the past few years, especially in the US, that to me are like very interesting inflection points for the progression of, or for like what's wrong, I guess, with how we talk about contemporary art, at least particularly in the US. And I'm very aware of my position as like someone who lives in New York and things feel a certain way there. And I'm interested in like how that differs from city to city, but really looking at like, what's the toolbox that we have currently, which to me appears to be this representational paradigm, and asking like, can we build new tools? What would those tools be? And not necessarily being dogmatic and saying like, this is, the one way forward, but just looking at like what other options there are for how we talk about these things and what those options get us and where they're coming from. So anyway, but just to, like start from the very beginning again. So this representational paradigm, just like baseline that idea, I'm just talking about the idea that like, essentially understanding of things where, there's a thing in itself and then its image or a model and a copy, kind of going back to things like, like the old Plato's cave example. And of course, like this is an idea that's been continually comes up in aesthetics and philosophy, but also just in visual culture. Like Renaissance perspectival revolution to like 19th century realism having a sort of mandate to represent only what the artist knows and sees empirically, et cetera. And then into like the modern period as well. So what do I have next? Oh yeah, yeah, last minutes. But then yeah, so I think that like, and yeah, like of course then like with modernism, like there's this at a certain point in the 20th century, there's also this shift towards art being considered an expression of human life, and like this question of like, yeah, like the artist not only sort of representing the quote unquote objective reality of the world around him or her, but to insert some sort of like their own subjectivity into the picture. I really like, it's obviously maybe a controversial reference in some ways, but Heidegger's Age of the World picture has a, I think, nice definition of representation, and he traces it sort of etymologically, but he just talks about how representation means to set out before oneself and to set forth in relation to oneself. So sort of like representation is constantly hinging on the relationship between like the objects around you and a coherent self. I think that's something that's really important to me in thinking about this history of representation, because I think like essentially, there's no representation without a sort of Western ideal of a coherent subject who sits at the center of the picture in this sort of like very humanist way. So yeah, so I'm interested in like how I'll sort of stay here. I'm interested in sort of like how this sort of relationship between representation and the self, and then in sort of the modern era, it sort of turns into this like tyranny of self-expression where the artist is constantly, just like spilling their self all over the place in terms of their work. But then, so like, and this problem of self-expression and the artist's subjectivity being forced into the picture constantly is really kind of delivered onto our doorstep via this very long history of Western philosophy. So I guess like in my practice, like I've, as I said before, delved into the sort of problem of representation, and I think like here right now I'm like really interested in particular in like, in terms of the art world in the contemporary moment, very interested in like the problem historically, in the sense that like I personally am of the mind that representational thinking has always been a problem and has always been sort of a drag on our like capacities for understanding the world around us, but also interested in how at this particular moment, like infrastructurally, technologically, politically, it's particularly a particularly frustrating framework. But so like historically, they'll just like kind of like go into like, just the stuff that I've been thinking about. So this is an image from an artist, American artist, Ulysses Jenkins' video, Massive Images. It's from like 1974, I want to say. And I just always like using this as a sort of like touchstone for the way that I've been thinking about, or like the angle that I'm coming at this like critique of representation from. But basically, so a lot of the thinking that I've been doing around representation is rooted in a sort of like Black radical thought tradition from like the US and the Caribbean. And basically, like to just run through what that is like, essentially have been very interested in the ways in which like Blackness in America and in, I guess just in the Western world overall, it kind of has no like, it doesn't precede representation at all. So there's a sort of way in which, like, basically in the Atlantic slave trade, the very first, presence of Blackness in the modern world comes from a sort of media campaign of, on the behalf of like white slave traders, to sort of create the idea of the Black from the idea of the African. And so then from there we go into, like even like the sort of like insurance like documents and sort of the ways that like classification happens, it's all sort of like this part of this like a sort of like aesthetic and like capitalist like ordering of things to sort of create this category of the black. And then you get to the U.S., and then of course there's like racist cartoons and like, you know, slave days and Reconstruction era. Then, you know, anthropological photography that like documents primitives and slaves. And then, you know, we get into like moving images and D.W. Griffiths and Birth of a Nation, et cetera. So basically just like the way in which blackness is wrapped up in a media history and is a sort of like mediated subjectivity has always been really interesting to me. And I think also like a really interesting object lesson for how like personhood and subjectivity become obstructive frames when there's no sort of essence that, like, I think like a lot of the discourse around black art over the course of like the entirety of its history has really been framed around this sort of like, you know, what are the stereotypes about blackness? How can we combat stereotypes and like show like what an authentic blackness is? But part of the problem with like this history is that there really is no authentic blackness at the center to show, because it's been this sort of like ongoing reinforcement through media objects of a certain subjectivity. So anyway, so this massive images piece, in it he has this line where he says like, you are massive images you've gotten to know from years and years of TV shows. The hurting thing, the hidden pain is written and bitten into your veins. And so I always think that's like a really great like way of configuring that, the relationship between like image and reality, and the fact that they're in a feedback loop, not like one, you know, separate from one another. And then there's other stuff that I've been interested in with that. I think like, you know, the other framings of the sort of particular ontological situation of blackness. You know, there's like Fanon talks about the like blackness being a totally socially governed self. So there's no like self at the center. But this is another way of phrasing what I'm saying. But no like self at the center of blackness that's like a coherent subject independent of its context. And likewise, Orlando Patterson, who sort of gets framed as a leading Afro-pessimist thinker, talks a lot about blackness being a state of social death. And he terms that as like sort of materially living a sentient object without guaranteed social subjectivity. Anyway, so I think that this stuff's also very interesting because I think, again, going back to the whole selfie feminism, like awkwardness of a 1970s film and like film theory framework in terms of looking at images today, which I do think often prevails in a lot of ways. I think that stuff like this is interesting because it can kind of recode some of the things like Laura Mulvey or like other directions from that moment. And I think that it intersects with that, and that like, in our contemporary time, as I said before, we have this like sort of technological problem where our toolbox around how we talk about representation doesn't quite fit in a sort of like post-net or like post-mediatized world. And I think that's the case in that like, there, as I was talking about before with memes, like there are these new processes of signification. Like the cheesy example is something like, Pepe the Frog, where like, there's this image that can be repurposed and kind of, it's immutable. It doesn't have any sort of core message. I mean, and of course, like a lot of like thinking around like semiotics, like and signification understands this, but we still kind of end up in this like locked in, or sort of like inflexible framework for how we think about these things. And then the other side of it, I think technologically also, is sort of the new like camera consciousness that we have in our society, where there's sort of this 360 degrees all the time capture, which I think like again inflects upon the sort of way that we talk about the politics of an image, where like, the idea of like, part of the critique that I had of the selfie feminist stuff was that like, I think that it overstates the actual like material implications of telling your own narrative when your narrative only exists on like corporate platforms, let's say, and you don't really own anything about your own image, you don't really own anything about your own story, you're just like reproducing this thing for this ongoing system. Anyway, so these are just kind of like the background things. And then also additionally with like a sort of post-net, like I guess like the other thing is the sort of like instability of a sort of like truth principle when you're dealing with the internet, which like, that's not really totally what this talk is about. And it's like a often like cliche and like unwieldy topic to talk about, the sort of like fake news, whatever stuff. But that's also something that's like an issue. But so I think that like all this stuff to me is, I'm interested in the way that like the internet as a technological, like creates this technological problem for a politics of like self-expression or a politics of looking and being looked at because of the way that it cuts and splices and rips and circulates and accelerates images and bodies, etc. So this is all to say that we need something new. And so it's like to summarize that, like, so yeah, the self is sort of, insofar as like I basically what I've been trying to do is to draw on like Black radical thought and like Black radical like aesthetics from the 20th century and stuff, to sort of, I guess, make as an object lesson to sort of explore the way that the self is ontologically and epistemologically intertwined with the image, and make an argument that it's not solely the case for Black individuals that that's the case historically, but that there's a kind of like mounting, like, I guess, universalization of that experience, partially because of technology, partially because of a Western philosophical perspective kind of ripping at the seams due to a number of different factors. Anyway, okay, so I was like, so I guess, yeah, so I'm interested in like basically what I was gonna talk about today is like the way in which, I guess, like in the last few years, watching certain art world events unfold, I've become very interested in the way that like this question of representation, which is often the sort of layer that we're discussing a lot of like these like political, social, like scuffles around art, that's like often the way that we're talking about them. I got really interested in trying to parse out like, I guess, the failings and, you know, minor successes of that sort of framework, but mostly the failings. So I was just going to talk a bit about the last two Whitney biennials as sort of like object lessons in thinking about this and thinking about the way that the art world mobilizes around like symbolic action and material action and sort of confusing the two, and also how representation, I think, sits at the center of the sort of like sticky problem of these things. But so if you're not familiar, though I imagine that many of you are, this painting that Dana Schutz, American painter, white American painter, made for the 2017 Whitney Biennial, and it caused a whole bunch of controversy. Like, this is a picture of an artist, Parker Bright, who stood in front of the painting to protest it. Basically, the painting was a representation of a photograph of Emmett Till, who was a young Black boy who was lynched in like the 1960s. And this photograph was a famous photo that was published in Jet magazine and widely circulated to sort of like nationally like drew attention to the issue. And so Schutz painted, this painting based on that photograph, and it caused like a total uproar. The British artist Hannah Black wrote an open letter in protest of it, and a number of people requested that it like be taken out of circulation, removed from the museum. And Parker stood in front, like staged a sort of performance protest and stood in front of the painting with this shirt that says "Black Death Spectacle." And so I think that I feel like it's like ethically I have to admit that I was involved in all of the hoopla around this, like, and very much on the side of, I wrote a thing to, like, it's sort of a letter of support, I guess, for Hannah's open letter. But I think it's interesting because, like, at the time it was very much like the charge was led by a lot of young Black artists who felt like, you know, it was really just ultimately, I guess, violent for Dana Schutz to reproduce this image, and like why, especially at that moment in American politics when there's all this like police brutality stuff going on, and, you know, just ongoing like dispossession and like criminalization of Black people, like why this, why now, and why her, kind of, especially when, like, you know, also with the demographics of who gets to, you know, participate in biennials like this, et cetera. But the battle around this was kind of largely fought ultimately in the public view over this idea of like property rights and cultural rights, and like kind of became this like free speech thing, like who gets to paint what, who gets to, you know, who owns like the racist history of America, to kind of white woman not paint a painting that refers to that and tries to deal with it. And it got really, really messy, and it kind of like, to me, over the course of, as it unfolded, became less and less interesting, and got further and further away from what really felt to me like the issue at hand. And so, yeah, I think that, like, and a lot of it sort of hinged on this idea of like empathy and like motherhood, and like, you know, the fact that like Dana Schutz, it was a whole like weird thing. But I think what was interesting to me about it, and what I want to talk about a bit in relationship to this like representation problem is that it felt like this like sort of almost, for me maybe in my own development, a watershed moment of like people trying to use representation to repair whatever violence is or to grapple with like the material politics of the world that we live in, and it just ultimately failing so intensely. And then also alongside this painting, there was this painting by Henry Taylor that was another painting of a screenshot from a video of a police brutality incident, the Philando Castile shooting, and like both of them are just trying to grapple with this thing that's happening in a very like, in a very real way, but then taking them up and reproducing them to comment on them, to try to like intervene in some other sphere, but it's like kind of, these layers are sort of stratified in a way that makes them, there's not actually that much interplay. So yeah, and I guess I became very interested in this moment, like in the sort of weight on, like the weight that the art world was putting on like symbolic intervention in this period of time, and then like a few other things happened, like around, I don't know, just like other things started popping up where just like everything had to be like a symbolic comment on something rather than, intervening materially, which makes sense, of course, because it's art, but it also kind of like seemed to be like getting like, it was this like mounting thing. So then like 2 years later in 2019, the most recent biennial, of course, was also marked with controversy around the board member Warren Kander's his tear gas fortune, et cetera. And so there were more open letters. Those were, there were letters from the staff. There were letters from artists. Hannah Black, again, got involved in that. And a lot of it centered around, I thought it was very interesting, it centered around sort of like, rather than, I'll talk about this in a second, but a lot of it centered around like the material necessity for artists to withdraw from the exhibition and like not participate. So rather than like, artists need to comment on the violences that are happening around us, a lot of like the public, or a lot of, I guess what like Hannah and other people were calling for was like a total like non-participation and a total rejection of the institution on the grounds that the tear gas thing was like too fucked up to engage with. But then of course like a number of artists who were included in the show maintained that their participation was okay because their work was radical or because their work was politically engaged. And then like Forensic Architecture did this video where they were investigating the tear gas canisters and made this like 3D models and like seek the canisters out and like various images from like conflict zones, and they like wrote a letter to like tell like a political body about this to sort of try to intervene. And it all just felt like very weird and like just like ill-conceived in a way, everyone's responses to me. I think there also were artists who were like, oh, it's okay for me to do this because I'm an artist of color, like, so I shouldn't have to give up my position in this institution. And so I guess I got very interested in this moment in like just basically like pitting these two moments against each other as like this sort of utter like fissure between the symbolic and the material layers of the contemporary art world, where people really don't seem to know how to like integrate symbolic action and material action. And I think that like, I think this work was interesting that it really attempted to, but I think that it also like relies so heavily on some sort of like evidentiary principle of art. And I think Rahel Ayema refers to this kind of thing as like research, or it was like, yeah, like research art. And I think that it's like, and how like research art is kind of like lost, like there's no more gas in the engine of research art because it's like not really that interesting to shine a light on like how bad something is when it's just going to continue to be as bad as it is. But so, yeah, I think that so I got really obsessed with the fact that there was like seemingly under within the toolbox that everyone seems to have to talk about both of these events, there seemed to be, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think this representational paradigm is the thing that is making it impossible to integrate what everyone thought needed to happen here and what everyone thought needed to happen here. And I think that, so basically that sort of inspired me to return to all the stupid writing I was doing in like 2016, 2017 to try to really figure out like, okay, like is there a way, if you just like kind of if you backed up entirely, like, is there a way to like think about art that would make this a lot easier, or like that would create some sort of, at least like, not like, oh, we'll fix museums and there will be no institutions with like dirty money, et cetera, but just have a way that like, a way to talk about this that just feels like a more textured and more nuanced, et cetera. So I know I'm probably going over, but I'll be done soon. So I think that, like, for me, number one, the thing is to get out from under this idea of, like, what is art expressing? What is art, saying about this person, whatever? I think the question for me really now is, like, what is art doing at any given moment? And this sort of, like, action-oriented question of, like, when you see this painting, like, what is it doing? Like, what is it actually? And I know people talk about this for, like, decades and decades, that we should talk about art this way, but it feels like it's worth, kind of hammering in that, like, that to me is the question that is most pertinent in any given situation. And likewise with this, like, what is it doing? It's not, it's not actually necessarily doing what it says it's doing. It's not intervening into this system. It's playing at an intervention and it's attempting an intervention, but it's not, there's the follow. It's like a bunt, not a slam, a home run. Anyway, so I guess I'm thinking, like, what if we place these moments under review with a different toolkit? So the toolkit that I'm invested in is basically this idea, as I sort of was talking about before, of starting from the place that's been offered up to us by like Black theorists theorists of Black existence from, like, the 1700s onward, who are already critiquing representation and critiquing the structure of subjectivity as we know it in the Western canon, and have been, like, for hundreds of years basically doing some of the work that I think would help us to think about art in a more interesting and politically viable way. So I'm interested, like, what if we start from the idea that following someone like Orlando Patterson or following Frantz Fanon or following Ulysses Jenkins, like, is it possible or to acknowledge that it is possible to live as a materially sentient object with no guaranteed social subjectivity, as Patterson says, or as an object/subject with no recourse in civil society. So basically acknowledging this idea that you're just a mass of images, a la Jenkins. I think this would, like, certainly shift the terms of the Schutz controversy. I mean, I think to me the most interesting thing was the fact that, like, basically all these, like, young Black artists went up against the art establishment and said, like, hey, like, this person doesn't have ownership over this. And I don't think it was with the intent of saying, and we do, and only we can make work about this. The intent was really to sort of show that there was this, like, impasse and that there was no ability for Black artists or Black culture or just Black people on the internet or whatever to really claim the image, and that's always the battle, that, like, the battle is always, like, dispossession, and I think Jared Sexton talks about, like, Blackness is this thing that, or maybe it's Moten, like, it's always this thing that's always open in the palm of your hand and, like, feels like it's for the taking. And so, like, that was what that moment was about to me. But this property rights and the way that we talk about, like, humanism and diversity and access, like, kind of created it as this thing about, like, well, who gets to paint Emmett Till? And then also, I think for me, like, thinking about this in terms of, like, revisiting it in terms of this massive images thing, I think there's an opportunity for this work to become, like, quite formalist and, like, really interesting in terms of, like, this image, like, almost certainly was painted from a digital image of a film photograph that was taken in the 60s, and, like, has, if you Google Emmett Till, there's, like, hundreds and hundreds of results for this photograph. Like, what does it mean to, paint something from a digital image like that in this style that's, like, completely abstracted, and then relaunch it into circulation, like, via a controversy the size of what happened in that exhibition? I think that's, like, a really, really interesting premise and a really interesting, just, like, experiment. I mean, however intentional or not, an interesting experiment in terms of digital circulation. So then I think also, like, the other part of what I'm interested in is that Black radical thought is, like, the first sort of pillar of this framework that I'm trying to think through. The second is just, like, a sort of generalized materialism. Again, feeling like there's a sort of, like, slippage between the symbolic and the material in how contemporary art is being talked about. So, like, kind of, like, following a line of thinking that a number of thinkers for, like, again, a few centuries have been working on. But lately I've been finding a lot of clarity in this book, Sonic Flux by Christoph Cox, the way that he talks about it. And he just terms it as, like, he's talking about sound art a lot in it, but he's also, like, very, makes the point that he's like, this is, like, I want this framework to be used elsewhere, and it's not, I don't think it only applies to sound, but he talks about approaching art with a rigorous materialism that construes human symbolic life as a particular instance of transformative processes evident through the natural world, processes that can often fall into the category of processes of becoming. So he's thinking through sound, but he's talking about like larger aesthetic conversations. And yeah, to me, I think the way that he's thinking like really integrates the symbolic and the material in like a really beautiful way that doesn't rely on like representation and visuality like as it's sort of like a priori context. And then the third part is thinking through the Gothic and the cybernetic, following Mark Fisher. I don't know if people have read his Gothic materialism or the cybernetic fiction book. But this, to me, Fisher's like discussion of the Gothic and his taking up of cybernetics feels like a sort of midpoint between this sort of like Christoph Koch's sound art thing and then this like Black radical line of thinking. Or I guess like the sort of social death Black radicalism, or like Afro-pessimist, I guess people would say. But I think that it's sort of a loose synthesis where Fisher's really offering an approach that uses cybernetics, and I think that's important in terms of thinking about this massive images thing and these feedback loops where we're really not constituted as a coherent object, but we're in like a flux with these other elements. But he offers us like taking uptake of cybernetics, and then he also sort of retrieves the idea of the Gothic as a way of thinking a sort of immanent interconnection of material and immaterial forces. So essentially like thinking through matter rather than thinking through representation. And then these forces in his view are sort of linked by death rather than a vitalistic sort of link. So I think it's like kind of all these things are collected under sort of thinking, this like sort of symbolic and material intertwining, and that ultimately can happen through thinking through matter. So even like with Black anti-humanist thinking and Cox's like sonic flux, and then even things like going back to like Bergson and Deleuze, I think there's kind of this like ability to intertwine these things in a more like fluid and nuanced way. And so so that's kind of most of what I wanted to say. I wanted to end, this was supposed to be a video, but it didn't work. But it's Robert Morris's Box with the Sound of Its Own Making, which to me, I mean, I'm a huge Robert Morris fan, but I think this, in trying to write this and like thinking about like where do I see like this actually working out, I think that this work to me feels like a really great example of something that's like very like, it's very expertly sort of combining these different layers. I think that it's like this sort of like recursive aesthetic material relationship where the artist is not, a subject who's creating this thing and it just sits there, whatever. The artist is like a node in a sort of network of production that is kind of like looping over on itself. It's like, object, sound, like tool, hand, all flattened together into this like forever, like beautiful loop, a bad infinity, if you will. So that's my talk. Thank you.